If you'll be able to ask people who have lived through 1929 to 1939 on what the world was like during that time, they would most probably answer you by referring to those years as the longest 10 years of their lives. Well, we can't blame them, because this was the time of the Great Depression, which was the worst economic depression in the history of the United States. It sounds scary, because it really is. Welcome to Financial Pay Dirt, where you learn about the best and most interesting topics on YouTube. After sending Wall Street into a panic and wiping out millions and millions of investors all over the world, the Great Depression slowly eased out and the stock market was able to see light again. Imagine how happy Wall Street might have been then, huh? But how did this happen in the first place? And what had caused this to happen? Join us as we take a walk down memory lane. So first, when and how did we end up with the greatest downfall in economic history? Let us tell you a quick story of how it all began. The year 1929 did start off well. Maybe even too well if you look at it now. Throughout the 1920s, the US's economy expanded rapidly. That's why this period was called the Roaring Twenties. The stock market underwent rapid expansion and had reached its peak in August 1929. However, as stock prices continued to rise, production had slowly declined and unemployment rates had risen. Wages began to decrease, consumer debt proliferated. The agriculture sector of the economy struggled due to drought and falling food prices, and banks had an excess of large loans that could not be liquidated. All of these had led to the American economy entering a mild recession during the summer of 1929. But still, the stock market continued to reach stratospheric levels that could not be justified by expected future earnings. Now we have reached October 24th, 1929. This day is known as Black Thursday. Do you want to guess why? Well, here's a clue. They wouldn't use the word black if something good came out of this day. As nervous investors began selling overpriced shares in large amounts, the stock market suddenly crashed. And boy did it smash hard. A record-breaking 12.9 million shares were traded that day. 5 days later, on October 29, or Black Tuesday, some 16 million shares were traded after another wave of panic swept Wall Street. Millions of shares ended up worthless, and those investors who had bought stock markets on margin were wiped out completely. As consumer confidence vanished in the wake of the stock market crash, the downturn in spending and investment led factories and other businesses to slow down production and begin laying off their workers. For those who were lucky enough to remain employed, wages fell and buying power dramatically decreased. Many Americans forced to buy on credit fell into debt, and the number of foreclosures and repossessions climbed steadily. Yikes! Now going back to the present. Of course, the stock market crash doesn't just happen on its own, completely out of nowhere. There were several problems with the economy that many didn't see, and more importantly, many others ignored. Let us look at them one by one. Income inequality. One major economic issue of the time is one that still greatly affects America today: income inequality. Research from UC Berkeley professor Emmanuel Bay suggests that Americans in the top 1% of income in 2012 had the highest percentage of the nation's income since 1928. In 1928, the top 1% made a whopping 19.6% of the nation's income. Economic growth would inevitably stall. The Roaring Twenties should have meant great employment numbers through the decades, as industries expanded rapidly, right? Well, this was not the case. The wages of workers did not increase to the same degree that corporate profits increased. Products were being made, but many were no longer able to afford them. Spending slowed, playing a part in stock prices declining. SMOOT-HAWLEY Tariff Act. Does this sound familiar? The SMOOT-HAWLEY Tariff Act was first introduced to Congress in 1929 and became an official law in 1930 after the stock market crash. This act was meant to help protect America's farmers from overseas competition by putting in a protectionist policy, but this did not turn out well. The tariffs were warned against before being signed into law, immediately unpopular and were quickly disagreed upon. Other countries increased their tariffs as well, and trade between nations plummeted for several years. The fallout from the SMOOT-HAWLEY Tariff Act hurt not just the US but the world's economy, and this may have made the depression worse. the Federal Reserve. Some economists believe that some decisions made by the Federal Reserve played a role in the economy worsening. Some have even argued that the Fed is the reason it became a depression at all, and that had they been more active and aggressive, it could have been held to just a mere recession. The Federal Reserve did not give aid to banks, and thousands of smaller ones collapsed, in part because the Fed declined to create more cash as the money supply tightened. This was far different than the Fed of the Roaring '20s, which increased money supply plenty throughout the decade. With everything that is happening, what was it like to live during the Great Depression? No one was spared. Everyone was affected. Even upper middle-class professionals such as doctors and lawyers saw their incomes drop by as much as 40% during this time. Families who had previously enjoyed economic security suddenly faced financial instability, or in some cases, financial ruin. The average American family lived by the Depression-era motto: use it up, wear it out, make do, or do without. Many tried to keep up appearances and carry on with life as close to normal as possible while they adapted to new economic circumstances. Households embraced a new level of fragility in daily life. They kept kitchen gardens, patched worn-out clothes, and passed on trips to the movies as they privately struggled to retain ownership of their home or car. Magazines and radio shows were centered in teaching people how to stretch their food budget with casseroles and one-pot meals. Favorites included chili, macaroni and cheese, soups, and cheap beef on toast. Potlucks, often organized by churches, became a popular way to share food and a cheap form of social entertainment. Many families strived for self-sufficiency by keeping small kitchen gardens with vegetables and herbs. Some towns and cities allowed for the conversion of vacant lots to community thrift gardens, where residents could grow food. The women workers increased. Some families maintained a middle-class income by adding an extra wage earner. The number of married women in the workforce dramatically increased. Some people criticized married women for taking jobs when so many men were out of work. But they were just taking clerical or service industry positions that weren't seen as socially acceptable for men at the time. Women found work as secretaries, teachers, telephone operators, and nurses. But in many cases, employers paid women workers less than the male employees. Mental illness. The stress of financial strain took a psychological toll, especially on men who were suddenly unable to provide for their families. The national suicide rate rose to an all-time high in 1933. Marriages became strained, though many couples could not afford to separate. Divorce rates dropped during the 1930s, though abandonments increased. Some men deserted their families out of embarrassment or frustration. Riding the rails, illegally hopping on freight trains became a common thing, which was a very dangerous way to travel. Lastly, crimes spiked. Violent crimes were broadcasted through radio announcements and in newspaper headlines, creating fears that the hard times may have created a crime wave. But this was more hype than reality. Crimes initially spiked during the first few years of the Great Depression, but nationwide, rates of homicides and violent crimes began to fall sharply between 1934 and 1937, a downward trend that continued until the 1960s. How did all of this period end? Was it as quick as how it began? Well, that's a big no. New Deals. In 1933, the first New Deal began, which focused on the economy, banks, and farmers in an attempt to financially strengthen them. The Emergency Bank Act attempted to stabilize the banking system after thousands of failures, while the Agricultural Adjustment Act and the Emergency Farm Mortgage Act aimed to save farmers, their farms, and their crops. The first New Deal also helped put an end to prohibition and put together public works projects like the Civilian Conservation Corps. After a couple of years of passing initiatives to help save businesses and industries, in 1935, the second New Deal began. This initiative sought to help poor, unemployed, struggling Americans. Some programs continued to help farmers, even paying them to plant specific crops. Others sought to improve conditions for workers, like the National Labor Relations Act. Perhaps most importantly, though, the Second New Deal implemented the Social Security Act. In FDR's second term, several programs were colloquially known as part of a Third New Deal. Programs here would help fund affordable housing and give workers overtime pay. These programs stimulated the economy and helped to lower the unemployment rate. World War II. A lot of people say that it was the Second World War that ended the Great Depression. Government spending went up significantly when the US joined the war, and unemployment dipped below 1 million unemployed Americans. American soldiers were able to return home to an economic boom. This may have helped bring everything back to perspective, but it was surely not the sole reason. What lesson did this period teach us? Let us give you 3 takeaways from this situation. Number 1. Avoid debt. With the credit card industry thriving, spending what you don't have now is encouraged left and right. This makes it hard to believe there was a time when people actually believed that debt should be avoided. Our grandparents lived by this principle. If they didn't have the money, then they would simply need to figure out a different plan on how to get what they needed. It might be borrowing it from a friend, saving up money, or finding something that could be used instead. Going into debt to get it accomplished was definitely not an option. Number 2. Use what you have. Nowadays, whatever problem you may have can always be solved by buying something else. If something isn't exactly right, go buy something that is. In our grandparents' time, when something broke, they first took a look to see if it could be fixed. If it couldn't be fixed before it ended up in a trash can, they would consider whether it could still be useful for something else. There is no reason to go out and spend money on something new if you can get the same thing accomplished with the things that you already have. Number 3. Save for the rainy days. Like the present situation, rainy days eventually come. Our grandparents were well aware of this and specifically put aside money for these rainy days. It's now what is commonly referred to as an emergency fund, and something that comes in quite handy when your financial plans don't go exactly as you imagine they would. What we are experiencing now is quite similar to what the Great Depression was like. Like what happened then, we can't expect everything to turn around quickly, because it do take its time to go that low. Hopefully, when the number of positive cases subside, the government could enact laws which could help everyone get up on their feet for the succeeding years to come. And there you go, guys. You just found out everything you need to know about the Great Depression. What details shocked you the most? Let us know below. Thank you for watching. Also, turn on your bell notifications so you don't miss out on our future videos. See you next time.